I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Today we present Session 2 of Doing the Right Thing, an exploration of ethics with Brit Hume, Robert George, and Chuck Colson. These sessions were filmed in front of a student audience. Each session ends with the panel taking questions from the students. Let's get right to Session 2. Is there a moral law, and can we know it? Here's series host Brit Hume.
Welcome back to this series on ethics being conducted here at Princeton. The sponsors are the Witherspoon Institute here at Princeton and the Colson Center in Lansdowne, Virginia. If you were with us in the first session, you know that we have a panel of authorities and a cross-section of students. In that session, we studied the ethical failures which led to the 2008 financial collapse, the consequences of which we'll be experiencing for years. The first session suggests that many of the problems we face today result from the breakdown of ethics, that we are in a moral crisis. So if we attempt to fix this, what's the first thing we have to do? We have to ask ourselves whether there's a standard of truth by which behavior can be judged. Is there a moral law by which we're all governed? These are the key questions we'll be talking about today in this second session. Let me reintroduce our panel. Dr. David Miller, Director of Princeton Faith and Work Initiative and Associate Research Scholar at Princeton. Michael Miller, Director of Programs at the Acton Institute. Dr. Robert George, Professor of Jurisprudence here at Princeton. Charles Colson, founder of Prison Fellowship and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And Dr. Glenn Sunshine, Central Connecticut State University Professor of Early Modern European History. There was one man in modern American history who concluded from a prison cell that there was a law we have to live by, both written and unwritten. While imprisoned, he wrote one of the great documents of modern times. He grounded his ethical decisions on a transcendent authority in the law, and he sought justice and truth. To talk about that man, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., we have interviewed his niece, Alveda King.
My uncle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., wrote a letter when he was incarcerated in Birmingham, Alabama. And of course, they have called Birmingham Bombingham because the 16th Street Church was bombed there. My father, Reverend A.D. King's home was bombed there when we were in the home. And so there was a lot of strife and racial tension there. Black people, we were called Negroes in those days, were being slaughtered, literally. The little girls who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church, I went to school with one of the little girls. Our home was bombed, firebombed, and half of the house was destroyed. And so it was during these times that my uncle was leading the protest and saying that this was really unjust. And during those protests, he was incarcerated, he was locked up, he was in jail. And while he sat in jail, he began to ask, where's the church? He had also been on record as saying that Sunday morning at 11 o'clock in America is the most segregated hour in the country, because you had what was called the white community or the Caucasian community in their churches, the Negro communities in their churches, and they were not getting together. And so my uncle began to cry out, and he wrote on scraps of paper, they say toilet paper or tissue paper or scraps of old paper that no one wanted in that jail. And he began to write to the conscience of America, asking the pastors, why are your voices silent? Where are you? And the pastors really did not respond at that time. My uncle's formal education came, of course, from the Bible, and certainly from philosophy. He was a student of philosophy, he had a doctorate of philosophy. He studied the works of many people who had legal professions and legal minds. And so as Dr. King mulled over and reasoned with and thought about the moral dilemma of our nation during his lifetime, he began to write about that. And his first audience would have to be men like himself, pastors, spiritual leaders, who should have had the strength and the integrity to be able to resist evil. And so that would be his audience. During my uncle's lifetime, when he had to consider whether he would obey the law or disobey the law, he had to think about the moral value of a law. And when he was challenged by his critics, they would say, King, you're stirring up strife, you're causing problems, you're breaking the law, we're bound to honor the law. Whenever he was faced with a challenge or a question as to what his actions would be, if the law of the land was an oppressive law, if the law of the land was something that was going to harm what he called the least of these, then he would go to the higher law, the divine law, the natural law. And so looking at man's laws and then God's laws, then it takes courage, especially in our day and time. when there is so much question and division and what's right and what's wrong, what's morally correct, what's ethically correct. But Dr. King would always say, if a law is unjust, it is our moral responsibility to resist the unjust law. And that is the basis of the civil rights movement.
Dr. King's has to be one of the more inspiring stories of modern times. Of course, we all know the result. Laws were changed, and in due course, long-seated cultural prejudices were reduced. America's a different place now. Let's see how the panel explains the motivations and King's belief in a moral law.
We now hear from Dr. Glenn Sunshine.
I think it's pretty clear that Dr. King was operating out of a very long, fundamentally Christian tradition. It does come out of Jewish ideas about justice, the Christian ethic of love, the concept of the image of God, but also the natural law tradition. And I think that one of the reasons why his appeal worked was that it occurred within a culture that broadly accepted that tradition.
Dr. Robert George joins in.
The great contribution of the Judeo-Christian tradition takes us beyond what the Greeks and Romans were able to achieve, because it identifies as fundamental the principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. And it's that principle of equality, the equal worth of every human being, no matter how high or how low in the world's eyes, no matter how rich or poor, weak or strong, all being equal. That's the principle to which Dr. King appealed. Now the question is, where did he get it? Where did he get it? He got it out of this basic tenet that comes in the very beginning of the Bible. And that is the proposition that man, though made from the dust of the earth, is nevertheless fashioned in the very image and likeness of God, the very image and likeness of the divine creator and ruler of the universe. That's where King got that fundamental notion. Now, does that notion depend on divine revelation? I would join King in saying, not necessarily. King appealed to what he called the natural law. He's in line here with a very great tradition. He quotes and cites some of the famous figures in the tradition. It's called the natural law tradition of thought about ethics and law. For example, he appeals to St. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval thinker, and to St. Augustine. And according to the tradition of natural law, there are great moral truths, including truths about the fundamental dignity of human beings, that while revealed in Scripture, are also, at least in principle, knowable by reason itself. And that was how someone like Dr. Martin Luther King could find a principled, objective moral basis for standing up against the great evils of his day, especially the racial injustices we find in things like segregation.
Chuck Colson responds.
Robbie, I think you and I are the only two lawyers on this panel.
Are we the only two who are guilty?
We should be repenting. We should be repenting.
That's why you're on that side.
But the fact of the matter is that having studied law and having done an honors program in constitutional law, I think the finest document I've ever read in modern times, written on the authority of the law, was written on scraps of toilet paper from that Birmingham jail cell by Martin Luther King, who never studied law. There's a lesson in that.
Well, there is, and let me give you a couple of thoughts about what I think the lesson is. One, King was not a lawless man. Breaking law to him was something that could not be done lightly. In fact, he said that where it is necessary to break the law because of its injustice, it must be done openly and not in hiding, lovingly, and with a willingness to bear the consequences, to suffer the punishment. That's how much he believed in law, because he knew that law, far from being the enemy of freedom, was the condition of freedom. Right. And respect for the law was important. But he gave 2 cheers for the law, not 3. Why not 3? Because law can be unjust. And where the gravity of the injustice of the law puts it in opposition to a law above the law, the higher law, the natural law, the divine law, then the higher law must prevail. And in that case, lovingly, openly, with a willingness to bear the consequences, one must break the law.
What I think King proves more than anything else, that there is a truth which is knowable. And one of the things that's crucial here, if we're going to rebuild any kind of an ethical consensus, in our common lives together is that we agree there is some standard that we're going to live by. So truth has got to be knowable for there to be ethics. Ethics, by definition, how things ought to be, presupposes that that's contrasting with how things are. Professor Miller was talking about C.S. Lewis earlier in the first session, and Lewis argued and became a believer because he discovered that all the civilizations he could study back through history had all had some idea of moral truth. And so he assumed it was given to them and it wasn't just an accident or a coincidence, that all peoples have had this common understanding of what is right and what is wrong.
I think it's the end of The Abolition of Man, which you should all read. He actually goes through and lists out different moral ideas from different cultures. And they all are generally the same. He says, maybe you can have 6 wives or 1 wife, but you can't have any woman you want. Right? You can't just take what doesn't belong to you. And I think one of the things that we have to do also is we have to go back to our own experience. We experience ourselves as moral agents. We experience ourselves as free, as able to make choices between right and wrong, good and evil. And I think the danger that we have is that instead of going back to our own experience, we end up kind of listening to the sophistry that we learn from maybe your freshman philosophy professor who's decided to tell you that, well, truth doesn't really exist and you're just a provincial little fellow and you don't really understand things. But all of our experiences really tell us differently. And I think that in order for us to understand this, I think this is what that Dr. Martin Luther King was drawing upon, is this fundamental experience that we have of the knowledge between right and wrong, even if we can't fully act upon it.
One of the people who's spoken about the knowability of truth very eloquently is a friend of mine who's the president of Calvin Seminary in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Neil Plantinga.
People wonder about truth. Truth is a correspondence between what we say and what is. It's the phenomenon of being right about reality. Moral truth is simply a claim about what's right or wrong that is true. And of course, we know that it's right to love people and wrong to be malicious toward them. It's right to be good to animals and wrong to be cruel to them. Right to abolish slavery, wrong to defend it. So if you say that it's always wrong to torture children for the fun of it, that statement is true. And it's true in every culture. It's true whether we want it to be true or not. It's simply dead on true. There are all kinds of things that basic elementary moral truths that we can know and do know. Even 3-year-olds have a keen sense of justice when it comes to getting treats or sharing toys. It seems that a sense of right and wrong is built right into us. We count on truth in courts, in schools, in commerce, in everyday life. If there were no truth, or if we couldn't know it, ordinary life would be virtually impossible.
It does seem that reduced to its most basic element, what Dr. King was saying is that this treatment of us is not fair. And that's an argument you hear made by children from the youngest ages. I mean, no sooner are they able to speak than they're telling you that whatever you're telling them to do is not fair. But it springs from an idea that seems inherent. So the question does arise, even in little children, where does it come from?
Well, Brit, there are studies going on at Harvard today, and one of the doctors working on this found a part of the brain which actually processes moral thought. And a recent study of children, babies, 6 months old, they knew right from wrong. They could tell one thing is right, one thing is wrong. You're absolutely right. You take a ruler away from a 3-year-old kid, he's going to say, that's mine. He knows that's wrong. So it's bred into us. The Bible says it's written on the heart. It really is something we know. And this is what King was appealing to. He was appealing to this transcendent moral authority, which not only is there objectively because every society has understood it, but is there subjectively because we know it internally.
Let's bring the students that are in this room now. We've seen on this panel a consensus that there are absolute truths, that there are moral codes that we can agree on. But let's hear what the students have to say. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lauren Kussner. I'm an undergraduate at Princeton. You had talked about how it's observed even in infants that humans seem to have this innate sense of what is right and what is wrong. And in terms of finding out the source of that, it had been proposed perhaps it's written on the heart. However, an increasingly popular view, especially in evolutionary biology, is that it's written on the genes, that our moral behavior has evolved in us as a result of it being conducive to survival. In order to live in large groups, it's better that we all respect each other's property, each other's lives, etc. So given this challenge to the source of our moral beliefs and moral behavior, how do we proceed from there?
That's a very good question, a very provocative question, because in discussions that I've participated in about how we came to think and believe what we do, and when you start asking people about how you order society and so forth, and you'll often hear a kind of a utilitarian argument made for various moral, what we think of as moral precepts, because it's simply society works better when people socialize and learn to accommodate one another and so on. And these things, as the questioner suggests, may be written on our beings by the process of evolution as we've come to learn to live together and so on. Good question. What about that argument?
Again, Dr. Glenn Sunshine.
Let's just look at the evolutionary psychology for a moment. It's based on the Darwinian principle of natural selection. Natural selection occurs within a species. It is me outcompeting someone else that is human to pass my genes on down to the next generation. That's the principle behind Darwinianism. Under those circumstances, the Marine who throws himself on the grenade is a loser. He does not pass his genes down to the next generation. His competitors in the platoon get to do that. He's a loser. Are you willing to say that? Does your moral sense tell you that his self-sacrifice is the act of someone who is not fit to survive? If the answer is no, then you've got an internal incoherence in your analysis.
Here's Michael Miller.
The whole question of evolutionary psychology and biology and how it works to genes, I think, is maybe too complex to get into here. But I do think that, kind of following up on what Professor George said earlier, if going back to our experience, we experience ourselves as moral agents with freedom. We experience...
Give us an example of that. In what sense do we do that?
Okay. I'll give you an earthy example. A dog makes decisions, but they don't make free choices, right? A dog looks at the food in front of them and says, there's a lion back there. Well, I won't eat it because I don't want to get eaten by the lion, okay? But no dog looks at another dog and thinks, wow, she's beautiful, but I think I'll wait till marriage. Okay? That doesn't happen.
Almost.
I confess I've never heard that analogy used in my whole life. You'll never forget that, ever. Okay? Now, but what happens there, I said it would be earthy. Okay.
I love it.
So what happens is the person is able to look into himself or herself and see actually what's happening. You can even feel, for example, something pressing upon yourself, like irritation, anger, whatever it might be, and you can make a decision not to let that affect you, right? When you wake up in a bad mood, you don't, like I have little children. When they wake up in a bad mood, they're in a bad mood, okay? And so part of what we're trying to do is train them to say that you're not controlled by your feelings. You're not a slave to your passions. You're free. And I'd say that this ability of transformation, and again, I'm not a specialist in evolutionary biology, but even this experience of this possibility of transformation, the whole experience of repentance and conversion, that you go from one way of living to now a new way of living, seeking after beauty and truth and goodness. I mean, this seems to create a serious problem for the idea that you're genetically predisposed to act in a certain way. And I think Mr. Colson, who spent a lot of time in the prisons, could probably develop that.
Well, exactly. Let me just say, because this is a course on ethics, that is important to understand in a completely materialistic universe. If we are simply programmed by our genes, if we're not in our control of ourselves, then the highest ethical attainment is survival. But the world works just the other way. When I was in prison, and I had a lot of personal problems, and my dad had died, and a lot of things went wrong. My son was arrested. A man in my prayer group, who was then a senior United States congressman, called the President of the United States, then Gerald Ford, and said, I'd like to go in and serve the rest of Chuck Colson's prison sentence so he can go home. That's an extremely unselfish act. That wasn't programmed by his genes. That was by his love for me. I've seen it in my own daughter, who's raising a single mom, raising an autistic child, devoting herself totally to this other person. I mean, this is the whole meaning of agape love. So if we're talking about ethics, we have to understand that there's got to be a standard of what ought to be beyond personal survival, or beyond personal autonomy, or any of the code words we hear on campuses today or in public discourse. There's got to be some higher value, and there'll never be an ethical standard unless there is a truth which can be known by all, a truth that cannot not be known because it's true. There's a certain way the world is made, and seeking that which is truth is the great goal of life. And out of that comes an ethical system.
There's been some discussion on this panel about this whole idea of moral relativism, which we seem to believe as a group has kind of taken hold. But I wonder, are there really any pure people who are purely moral relativists?
David Miller responds.
There seemed to be this polarity we've set up, isn't there, that you're either a moral relativist or a moral absolutist. And of course, that pure type seldom exists. And I want to introduce to our conversation a third category, and that's the compartmentalizer. And I think this happened during the civil rights movement, and it's still going on today, where someone in their private life will indeed assent to some higher moral order and some sense of right and wrong and some sense of a timeless truth. But for whatever reasons, peer pressure, public pressure, financial pressure, in the public domain, they shut that part down, and they live a bifurcated or a compartmentalized life. So there is, I think, many people who are struggling with doing the right thing, however we understand that, appealing to a higher moral order, that's some timeless truth, but somehow shut that down in the public domain, whether it's the workplace, whether it's the political sphere, arts and sciences, academia, and they save that for their private life. And it's ultimately a very dangerous split.
Is it possible to be
It would be hard to live a life as a consistent moral relativist, not making any kinds of moral claims, really supposing that anything anybody did was acceptable because nothing could be wrong. I mean, you'd find yourself unwilling or unable to condemn the crimes of Hitler, you know, the gratuitous murders of millions of people, or of Stalin, or of Mao, of Pol Pot, or the terrorist attacks from Al-Qaeda, and so forth and so on. What would you tell your children if you had children? And this, Brit, goes to that incoherence, because often it's people who pride themselves on being great proponents of human rights, great disciples of Martin Luther King, people who condemn slavery and discrimination of all sorts, but then proclaim themselves to be moral relativists. So what's going on here? Where does that come from?
I'm rather fond of pointing out that every time someone tells me they're a moral relativist, I challenge them to let me drive with them in traffic sometime. Because inevitably, when someone cuts them off, they get upset. You know, even on a mundane level, you can't really live with it.
Can we get some further questions?
Hi, I'm Matt Butler. I'm a sophomore at Princeton University. Professor Miller, you mentioned the idea of the fact that sometimes there's a divide between people's personal beliefs and personal understanding of what's right. And what impact, though, should people's faith lives or sort of personal understandings of the right and wrong have in the civic sphere? Should the civic sphere also have an influence on people's idea of what's right and wrong? Should we have a country where, for instance, if my revelation tells me that stoning someone is the acceptable manner of punishment, that that's okay because I have this revealed truth? Or should we, in fact, allow reason to sometimes take precedence over the way that religion should, guide our lives?
It's a terrific question with many subpoints to it, but if I hear at the core what you're asking is, should, and if so, how one's religious beliefs, one's worldview shape and inform one's ethics and behavior in the marketplace, among other spheres. I would argue that it has to, that if our worldview or faith, whatever the tradition might be, is a constituent part of who we are as human anthropology, who we are as beings, to ignore that or to deny that means we live a false life. We shut down part of who we are. Now, how to do that in a world where there are sometimes competing views makes it, to be sure, a challenge. One has to sometimes separate out what I call beliefs versus behaviors. Beliefs about perhaps ontological truths versus how those truths play out in behavior in a pluralistic society. And there, I think we can actually find resources within the various religious traditions to find significant, shall we say, a Venn diagram of commonly shared beliefs about behavior in the public square, whilst recognizing there might be underlying differences to how that plays out. out.
Can you give us a sort of a concrete example of how that process might work that you just described in someone's life, someone with a particular set of moral beliefs confronted with some choices in their lives?
Minneapolis, there was a time at one point where many taxi drivers who came from Somalia were being told by certain religious figures they should not pick up anyone who was carrying alcohol or had alcohol in their breath. The local taxi authority had to figure out how to resolve that within the context of U.S. law, U.S. customs, and the licensing of a hackney driver. So there's many practical examples, and through civilized discourse, through understanding someone's logic and reason, and then putting it within the context of a democratic society, one comes to answers. But it's a terrific question, and one that will only become more and more one we're dealing with going forward.
Let's assume the moral relativist is correct, there is no truth. What happens to a society that really embraces that and carries it to its logical conclusion?
Well, in the absence of truth, what is there? How do we, if we're not searching for truth in the hope of governing our affairs, our common affairs, on the basis of truth, on what basis then will we govern or be governed? There will be government, believe me. There will be an order. What will it be? Well, if it's not based on the search for truth, then it's going to be based on power. Whoever has the power rules, and there can be no appeal beyond power. You know, you can try to displace somebody by brute force if he happens to be in power and you would prefer to be in power yourself, but there's no moral argument you can make about that person's illegitimacy or the illegitimacy or injustice of his rule. In the absence of truth, what are we left with? The will to power, the competition for power. In that situation, might makes right.
Michael Miller again.
That's absolutely right. If you're a purely accepted moral relativist position, then you have no ground on which to stand to say why another person is wrong in whatever they do. And as Professor George said, I mean, this goes back to Plato, like I mentioned earlier. There's either truth about man and the nature of what a good society and a good life is, or all decisions are made based on power. And those are your really two options. Now, you can find yourself somewhere in the middle. I think the other thing is that people don't want to accept truth because truth makes demands on us as individuals. So it's very easy to be a relativist.
Can the kind of revival of moral thought that we're discussing here today occur in the contemporary academic atmosphere of America?
No. I don't think so.
Why not?
Because there has to be a commitment to truth. And this doesn't mean, this is following on what Professor George said, I think there has to be a commitment to truth, that you're pursuing truth. Philosophy, remember, is philosophos, the love of wisdom, the love of truth. And I think currently in most modern academia in the West, the United States and Europe, you have a system that is not based on searching after truth, but instead is based on power and politics.
Well, it's certainly true that the phenomenon known as political correctness on campuses, Brit, is a suffocating one and very damaging to the intellectual enterprise of universities. On the other hand, I don't think we should exaggerate how far it's gotten. There are still many, many dimensions of university life at many universities, certainly including my own, where robust discourse and the exchange of ideas has not been suffocated by political correctness. We have a couple of students in our audience who are in a course that I co-teach with my colleague Cornell West. Now, Professor West is a man very much on the left. I'm very much on the conservative side of things. But students in that class are able to see a couple of professors who feel free to say exactly what they think, who feel free to engage in debate, to find some points on which we agree, some points on which we disagree, and the academic enterprise then goes forward without restraint. I think we need to see more of that on campuses. But for that to happen, the kind of established powers at universities, whether they're administrators, whether they're senior faculty, have to take affirmative steps to restore a culture that's conducive to the free and robust exchange of ideas and that does not suffocate certain ideas because they're regarded as out of fashion.
If there is no moral truth governing our behavior, you're going to see what happened on Wall Street and in the great meltdown of 2008. You're going to see what Michael Novak teaches, that Western liberal democracy is a three-legged stool: economic freedom, political freedom, moral restraint. Take one of those legs away, it goes. The same thing applies in society. If the moral restraint isn't in place, then the law is going to take us over and run us. And you're going to see as a result of all the moral breakdown, government increasingly more powerful and intrusive in our lives. It's inevitable.
It seems to me that the solution is not to give up on objective moral truth, but to make the search for objective moral truth really central to our deliberations as individuals and as a political community, and to ensure that the fundamental protections of democracy and civil liberties are there so that the pursuit of truth and the exercise of power are done in an accountable way. That's the way we protect ourselves against tyranny. It was the way of the American founders: Madison, Hamilton, Adams, Washington.
During these sessions, we've come to appreciate that one of the great heroic acts of modern history was when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led what became a great crusade to fight injustice. And he did so under the deepest conviction that there was the authority of a higher law. But that raises a more difficult question. If there is such a thing as truth, radical as that might sound in this age, then the question is, can we not only know what is true, but can we live by it? That's a hard question because the human will is stubborn. But that is the question we'll address in the next session, so be sure to join us.
Shane Morris here again. Thanks for listening to the Breakpoint Podcast and our special presentation of Chuck Colson and Robbie George's series, Doing the Right Thing. Join us next week for Part 3. If we know what's right, can we do it? If you're interested in purchasing the Doing the Right Thing DVD series, please come to our online bookstore at breakpoint.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.